everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this edition of Reporter's Notebook. It's Tuesday, and every Tuesday I have Emily with me when we record podcasts. Hi, Emily. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well because we just finished up our podcast, and it was quite, I don't want to say a heavy topic, but the economy has always been something that I've tried to grasp, and I ask so many questions whenever there's any sort of article about the economy. And so today we had the perfect guest to kind of break down what's going to happen post-pandemic. So Emily, why don't you tell our viewers what our podcast topic was about today?
Definitely. So today our special guest, we had a guest come back, a reoccurring guest, I guess you could say. Dr. Mike Walden joined us today, and he is from NC State University. He's awesome. And he wrote this article basically kind of breaking down post-pandemic life and the economy and what that could actually be. And it was really more, like you said, it wasn't a heavy topic. If anything, it was a little more lighthearted, a little more positive, because you've got it right there.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was reaching over because we just recorded our podcast. We do it in separate areas.
Yeah.
And I was just gonna use this as a prop, so I can show our viewers that we spent a lot of time into this podcast, and this was our what was it? This was the article that he wrote.
Yeah.
And so Emily, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go for it.
I was grabbing the prop. So Emily, why don't you tell our audience a little bit more about our podcast topic again?
Definitely. So again, it was basically an article kind of breaking down post-pandemic life and what that could look like with kind of the tools and the resources that we've used throughout the pandemic. And we might, carry those on out of the pandemic once we're through with it, and kind of still utilize a lot of those. So things like, teledoc, telemedicine, speaking through your doctor through your iPhone and being able to get prescriptions that way, remote learning, goods and services being delivered, food delivery services, things like that. So we really kind of talked about, the possibility of these really sticking around, and if anything, growing, after the pandemic kind of subsides.
Mm-hmm. And I was sort of playing devil's advocate because when it comes to, and I think our podcast,
you love playing devil's advocate.
I do, yes, because I always it's not that I like giving people a hard time. It's just that okay, but there's also this side of the coin. So.
But you gotta ask those questions. I mean, sometimes I feel like you get the best responses out of questions like that, because you've really got to look at both. You have to. You got to look at both angles.
Exactly. And even sometimes, I'll leave my opinions out of it, and I'll just, whatever is being said, I'll just say not the opposite of what it is, but more just kind of okay, but ... and then whatever the question is. But for a lot of the stuff that he was pushing, he was talking about how a lot of the businesses might use technology as a way to leverage what's happening in the pandemic, not having enough employees for their jobs, etc. And then I was kind of curious about, well, what about people who don't have access to technology? A lot of the businesses in rural North Carolina, let's think of Kinston, for example, might not exactly have the best internet access to leverage technology for their businesses to replace some employees. We were talking about how McDonald's was using kiosks to replace the people at the counter people. But it was okay, but that's McDonald's. They're $1 billion corporation that can invest in technology at the forefront of it to replace some of the lower paying jobs that a lot of people aren't going to because they're gaining skills in other areas. So I was kind of just playing a little bit of devil's advocate, and also talking about policies, how some people aren't comfortable with let's say having their entire life centered in their work life centered also where they live.
Right.
Yeah. So when it comes to remote work, because we were also talking about remote work, I don't know if you were having any sort of, not hesitation, but kind of the same kind of not red flags, but where it was kind of there is a lot of possibility for growth when it comes to technology enterprises post-pandemic. That's what the pandemic showed us, that we can work remotely and we can do all these things. But what about the setbacks that might happen or anything like that?
I know. Yeah, it was kind of interesting because like even when you were talking about, technology and access to technology, that kind of goes hand in hand with what our guest was saying about Wi-Fi access. I mean, a lot of counties, like you said, rural areas in North Carolina it's not that they don't have, the means to get internet. They simply don't have internet at all in that area. And so a lot of these things like the teledoc, like the delivery services, like remote education, remote working, just simply can't work for those types of people at all. But then another aspect he was talking about was, the pandemic has almost kind of been the driving force behind a lot of states and a lot of or the federal government, helping to fund a lot of these states and a lot of these rural communities to get that internet access, to get that high-speed internet. And that's only come because of the realization that so many people didn't because of the pandemic, So I think it's really interesting because I think in a way, like our guest was saying, the pandemic has kind of brought a lot more options, if you could say, to the table, a lot more ways to do things, a lot more resources and ability to do one thing and having a lot of different ways to do it. But, there are still those people and such gaps in income and other disparities that kind of accentuate those more or exasperate that more because, like I said, some people just completely don't have the ability or access to these things at all. So it kind of exasperates that, I think, divide a little bit more as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those were some of the areas that we were trying to understand with our guest. And our guest is completely, he retired this year. I think this is like his first semester where he's not teaching or whatever. And he talked about some of his own, he works at NCSU, and he talks about his own experience teaching remotely and some of the challenges that he had. He said, I don't think the reason why I was having trouble retiring was because his wife is also retired, and he was like, I don't think I could spend all day with my wife being retired and me being retired, but this pandemic kind of forced us and we could do it. And I thought it was funny.
I feel like that was so many people's mindsets, like, oh no, how am I going to do this?
Exactly, yeah.
Hey, it worked out.
Hey, yeah, and he was like, and we were perfectly fine. I was like, okay. And this is another podcast where we do have a video element towards it. So for anyone who's watching this edition of Reporter's Notebook, you can also watch this edition of with the politics in the podcast tab when we have in the features tab in our podcast tab as well.
Yeah, and I think this video component, I think we're going to stick with this for a little bit, if not, completely continue with this. I'm really loving this new feature, this new component we've added. I don't know how you're feeling about it, Victoria, but I think it's a really great addition to our podcast. I'm really loving it.
I love it too. And I've gotten some feedback saying, I got feedback from my mother saying, I love the video element.
So we're keeping it.
Exactly, yeah. So if there's any other feedback, keep it coming. We always like to look at the feedback and see what is successful and what isn't successful, so we can make sure that our podcast is really, because it's tailored towards the viewer, the listener. It's tailored towards people who live in this area, and it's tailored towards people who have an interest in what happens next in politics and policy, and want to dive deeper into the questions that the what's next question, really. So again, thank you, Emily, for joining me on this edition of Reporter's Notebook. For anyone who's watching this, you can listen to What the Politics on Apple and Spotify. You can watch at WNCT.com, and you can listen wherever you get your podcasts. All right, everyone, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the week. Bye.